I will never forget the afternoon it all began. I had left campus with a light drizzle on my shoulders, accompanied by Darila, my best friend. She had invited me to her house with things to study together for the history exam, but mostly because we were looking for shelter from the storm that was beginning to form on the horizon. Darila's house always seemed like a peculiar place to me. It was old, with dirty furniture and curtains as well as ornaments and porcelain figurines that made up her mother's collection. I have to admit that I felt her eyes following me. Her grandmother had been a collector and her mother followed suit, she said, but she never went into detail about what kind of things she collected. Besides those things that seemed interesting and rare, it was enough for me to know that this house was full of old objects that seemed to have a hidden history, and perhaps that was why I felt so attracted to the place. When we arrived, she took me to the living room where her mother left us a tray with coffee and cookies. We sat on the couch and began to go over the notes, but my attention was elsewhere. From the first moment I walked in, I had sensed something strange about the house. It wasn't the first time I had been there, but it seemed darker that afternoon. At one point, while my roommate went to get some markers, I decided to explore a little. It wasn't something she tried, but my curiosity had always been stronger than my caution. I walked over to her grandfather's library, which was a room at the end of the hallway that had always intrigued me. The door was ajar and the gloom seeping in from inside seemed to invite me in. When I set foot inside, the smell of dust and old paper enveloped me like a blanket. The walls were covered with bookshelves that seemed to hold centuries of history. Books with gilded spines, worn leather bindings, and titles in languages I didn't recognize filled the shelves. In the back was a small bust that was illuminated by a weak spotlight as if it was barely managing to stay lit. That's when I saw it. It was in a corner away from the rest, as if someone had left it there on purpose so it wouldn't be found. The book had a black leather cover cracked by time and a strange symbol in the center. It was a circle surrounded by what seemed to be ancient letters. I took it carefully, feeling its weight, and opened it with a tremor of excitement and nervousness. The pages were yellowed and fragile to the touch. They were full of diagrams, drawings, and texts in various languages. Some were recognizable as Latin or something similar. However, what caught my attention the most were the headings of some chapters. Attraction rituals, spells of domination, bindings and ties. A chill ran down my spine. Something in that book made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was as if it were talking to me and as if each page suggested promises of power and forbidden knowledge. Without thinking too much, I suddenly looked towards the door, making sure that no one had seen me when Darila returned. She found me standing in front of the bookshelf, pretending to look for something interesting. "What are you doing here?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. "Nothing, I'm just browsing." "You have very interesting books," I replied, trying to sound casual. She gave me a suspicious look but didn't insist. When she came back into the living room with a book among my things, I convinced myself that I was just taking it to have a quick look and nothing more. That night, when I got to my room, I locked the door and took the book out of my backpack. I placed it on the desk and lit a candle, since the dim light seemed to fit better with the atmosphere emanating from the pages. When I opened it again, I felt like I was crossing a threshold, as if each word written in the book took me a little further away from the world I knew. As the days went by, I forgot about the book, but it wouldn't forget me. It all started as a whim. Nicholas had always been the kind of guy who seemed unattainable. Tall, with a perfect smile, with a confidence that made him stand out anywhere. There was something about the way he spoke and the way his eyes seemed to laugh at the world, that made me impossible to ignore. However, for him, I was invisible. I was never a very attractive girl and I wasn't the kind of woman he liked either. We had met in some classes and once I even had the courage to approach him to ask him a banal question about a subject. He responded politely but nothing more. He didn't look at me the way I looked at him because he didn't even look at me. That was when the book began to form dangerous ideas in my head that night while I was going through the pages. By candlelight I found a section that made me hold my breath. Bindings of passion and will. The instructions were clear, detailed, and the disturbing thing was that they required items that seemed easy to obtain. At first I laughed nervously because how could something like that work? But at the same time a spark of hope began to burn in me. The process was to be done during a moonless night, with the exact words spoken in front of the mirror. It promised not only the person's love, but their complete devotion and their absolute surrender was too tempting a prisoner not to consider. I tried to approach Nicholas. By turning to the book, one afternoon I found him sitting in the cafeteria and my heart was pounding. As I walked towards him, I feigned casualness and smiled at him and asked if I could sit down. At first he seemed friendly and even polite, but the conversation quickly died. His answers were short, almost disinterested, and eventually I excused myself with a tight smile. I walked away from there with wounded pride. That night, as I looked at the book on my desk, the ritual words seemed to call me. Why didn't I tell myself? If it works, at least it will give me a chance to show him who I am, and if not, no one has to know. I thought so, but it never crossed my mind that it could lead me to the abyss. I spent the next few days collecting what I needed. The personal item was the most complicated. One day I saw him forget his sweatshirt at the gym. I didn't think twice and grabbed it before anyone else did. My fingers trembled as I put it away. Backpack, as if a strange chill ran down my spine. That moonless night I closed the door to my room, lowered the curtains and lit 3 black candles. In front of the mirror I placed Nicholas' sweatshirt in front of me. On the floor the old key I found at an antique market hung from a rope around my neck. In a bowl I mixed the wilted petals, the black sugar and a few drops of my blood, which I obtained by pricking my finger with a needle while stirring the concoction. The words of the spell came out of my. We spoke almost in a whisper. I don't know why, but the air in the room seemed to change. The heat from the candles became stifling, and for a moment, I felt like someone was there watching me from the shadows. The mixture began to bubble in the bowl and a faint metallic smell rose in the air. The reflection in the mirror seemed to distort, as if a shadow was moving behind me, but I didn't dare look directly. At the end of the ritual, I took the concoction and carefully poured it into the small vial. The final instruction was clear. I had to make sure that Nicholas lived through it so that the spell would be complete. The next day I carried the vial with me and waited for an opportunity, watching from afar, looking for a perfect moment. Finally, during a meeting at the faculty, I saw him leaving a small thermos on the table while he was talking to a group of friends. I took advantage of the distraction to base the contents on his drink. I felt as if my hands were shaking with anticipation and fear. It was over the days that everything changed. Nicholas began to look at me differently. It wasn't immediate, but little by little I noticed how he came closer and closer, how his eyes focused on me with an intensity one had never felt before. At first I felt euphoric. The book had already worked, he hadn't lied to me. At first, Nicholas' attention was what I had always dreamed of. He looked for me in the hallways, smiled at me from the other side of the classroom, and on more than one occasion he approached me just to chat. His voice, which had previously sounded confident, now became soft, almost vulnerable, as if I were the only thing that mattered to him. At first I was intoxicated by that feeling of power. The spell had worked, it was mine, but it wasn't long before that feeling turned into something much darker. Within a few days something began to change in him. His eyes, which had once been bright and warm, seemed to lose their light. His skin took on a pale, sickly tone, as if life itself were slipping away from him. When I saw him, I realized that he was no longer the Nicholas I admired from a distance. Something was consuming him. "Are you okay?" I asked him one afternoon while he waited for me outside my. "Yes, I just haven't been sleeping well," he replied with a weak smile, but it wasn't just the tiredness. His walk was slower and his voice more muffled. Even his friends began to notice. In the cafeteria I saw him sitting alone with a lost look. I heard one of his teammates muttering that he had been missing football team practice, something unthinkable for someone like him, since he loved the sport more than anything. One night, while I was trying to fall asleep, I was awakened by a subtle noise in the room. It was barely a whisper. It was as if someone was speaking very close to me, softly. I opened my eyes, but the room was completely dark, except for the light from my desk lamp. I stood up slowly, feeling a chill run through my body. The book was still there because I never intended to return it, and besides, Darila didn't seem to have noticed its absence. I tried to ignore it, but as I approached to turn off the lamp and put the book away, I noticed that the pages had moved. They were open to a new section that I didn't remember reading. Read before warnings and retributions. The text was ambiguous, but it made one thing clear. The energy that is taken always demands an equal or greater price. I felt as if the air in the room was heavy, as if something invisible was there accompanying me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Only my own reflection in the mirror, and yet I had the terrifying feeling that someone else was watching me. I packed everything and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep at all. The next day Nicholas showed up for class, but he could barely stand. His hands were shaking as he took notes, and his face was covered in cold sweat. After class, I saw him staggering toward the bathroom. Something inside me urged me to follow him. When I entered, I found him in front of the sink, holding onto the edge as if his entire body was going to collapse. "Nicholas, what's wrong with you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I don't know, I feel strange," he murmured. Suddenly, he bent forward and began to twist violently. The sound was awful, as if he were tearing at his lungs. When he looked up, there was a blood stain on the sink. My heart stopped at that moment. "I think I need to go to the doctor," he said in a barely audible voice. Then he staggered out, leaving me alone with the echo of his coughing in the bathroom. Friends, I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blood in the sink and Nicholas's gaunt face. What had I done? Was it possible that the spell was behind all this? I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that maybe I was sick, but something inside me knew the truth. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that I was just sick, but something deep inside me knew the truth. I went back to the book, desperately searching for a way to reverse the spell, but the words seemed confusing, as if they were mocking my attempt to correct the mistake. The more I read, the clearer it became what I had done. I couldn't undo it without an even greater price. As I was checking the book over and over, I felt a chill run down my spine. Looking up, I noticed that the candle I had lit began to flicker, but it did so in a frantic way, as if there was a wind. Suddenly the flame went out, leaving me in complete darkness. That's when I heard it, a deep breathing that wasn't mine. It felt close, too close. I turned around, but there was no one there. However, the air was close by and there was a feeling of terror that invaded me. "Who's there?" I whispered with a trembling voice. There were no answers, but I felt something brushing my shoulder like a cold caress. And harshly, I stood up, suddenly screaming, and ended up turning on the light. The room was completely empty, but the book was still open on my desk. Its pages were moving slowly, as if something was happening to them, but it was something I definitely couldn't see. Since that night when the candle went out and the air was filled with something indescribable, my life was no longer the same. It began with dreams. At first they were vague and confusing. In them I saw shadows moving around me. There was always a larger figure. In the shadows, a being with bright eyes stared at me closely. "This is what you wanted," said that deep, mocking voice. "Eternal love at any price." I would wake up screaming, bathed in cold sweat, but the terror would not end when I opened my eyes. During the day, while I tried to concentrate in class, that same voice would get into my head, telling me horrible things. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but soon I began to feel something else, a constant pressure, as if a presence was behind me, watching my every move. Meanwhile, Nicholas was getting worse and barely attended classes. When he did, a shadow of himself would appear. His friends began to whisper that something strange was happening to him. Some said he had fallen into a depression, others that he was seriously ill. I knew the truth, but I couldn't say anything. It was my fault. I had cast a love spell on him that, if it worked, was killing him. One day I found him in the university gardens, sitting under a tree with his head in his hands. His skin was paler than ever and his eyes were sunken into dark circles that looked like deep cracks in his face. I approached him feeling a mix of guilt and desperation. "Nicholas, are you okay?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He lifted the cloth slowly and for a moment I thought he was going to collapse. "I don't know what's happening to me. It's like something is inside me taking everything away from me." His words made my blood run cold because it wasn't just a physical illness. The spell was destroying him from within like a poison that couldn't be stopped. That night the whispers turned to screams. I woke up suddenly, opened my eyes and saw him. He was in my room, the figure from my dreams, a misshapen figure with elongated limbs and a hideous smile. He was now watching me from the dark corner of my room. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry. The figure moved slowly forward, each step making the air heavier. Just when I felt like I was going to collapse, he disappeared. The room fell silent. But I knew he wasn't really gone. Desperate, I turned back to the book, searching through the pages for a way to reverse the spell, but the words seemed to change before my eyes. The vandal who spoke of purification by fire mentioned that burning the objects used in the ritual could break the bond, but that would come at a very high price. That same night I took Nicholas's garment, the photo he had used, the remains of the brev, lit a makeshift bonfire in the backyard of my house and threw everything into the fire, the flames. They rose violently as if something inside them kept them alive, writhing and screaming. For a moment I thought it had worked, but then the air was filled with a nauseating smell. It was like burning flesh. I heard that deep, mocking laugh. Something was telling me that hadn't been resolved. The next day I learned that Nicholas had been returned to the hospital. His body could no longer take it. The poison from the spell I gave him to drink had completely consumed him. I managed to visit him, unable to stay on the sidelines, while he was dying because of me. When I entered his room, I almost didn't recognize him. He was connected to machines and his skin was wax. His lips could barely murmur words. I approached his bed with tears surrounding my face. Nicholas, I'm so sorry, I whispered, but I knew he couldn't understand me. That night, Nicholas passed away. There was no medical explanation for his death, there were only vague theories about multiple organic inefficiency, but I knew the truth. I had killed him. I thought the torment would end with Nicholas' death, but I was wrong. The entity wouldn't let me go, now I was its target. I appeared in every corner of my life, in the reflection of the mirror, in the shadow cast by my lamp. Sometimes I heard her walking through the halls, her presence surrounding me and suffocating me, her words a constant reminder of my guilt. I gave up, May of the world, consumed by guilt and fear. My mind fell apart and now I live in a perpetual state. I have a few protections that I found along the way, but I am waiting for the moment when the entity comes for me to take me away. I leave this as a warning: you find things that you should not have or do, leave them where they are. Some doors should never be opened because once you do, there is no way to close them.